Chapter 1: The Wedding That Wasn't. The scent of white roses filled the grand cathedral, their delicate petals scattered along the aisle like whispers of promises soon to be broken. Charlotte Lawson stood at the altar, hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting, expecting. But the man she was supposed to marry was nowhere in sight. A murmur rippled through the crowd as her maid of honor, Ava, hesitantly approached. She didn't have to say anything. The pity in her gaze said it all. Still, Charlotte's voice wavered. "Where is Ethan?" Ava pressed her lips together, glancing at the phone in her palm. Reluctantly, she turned the screen toward Charlotte. A single text message glowed against the screen. "I can't do this." The breath left her lungs. A strangled laugh bubbled up, hysterical, disbelieving. This wasn't happening. Ethan wouldn't do this. Not after 5 years together, not after the vows they wrote, not after he swore he loved her. But he had. A gasp came from the guests, followed by hushed whispers. Her mother's horrified face. Her father, silent, his hands clenched into fists. Charlotte could feel her entire world tilting, crumbling beneath her. And then, "Marry me instead." The words cut through the buzzing in her head, low and steady. Her dazed eyes turned toward the man who had spoken. James Calloway. He stood just a few feet away, tall and composed, his dark blue eyes locked onto hers. He was devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, the kind of man who carried an effortless air of power. But Charlotte barely knew him. He was nothing more than a name, a passing acquaintance, a guest invited through a family connection. Her lips parted, but no words came out. James took a step forward, offering his hand. "Don't let him humiliate you like this. You deserve better." Charlotte's heart pounded in her ears. This was madness, pure insanity. And yet, the weight of the stairs, the heartbreak squeezing her chest, the betrayal, it all felt unbearable. She turned to her mother, who shook her head vehemently. "No." Her father, on the other hand, studied James with an unreadable expression. Charlotte inhaled sharply. She could run. She could let this day be the most humiliating moment of her life, or she could take James' hand. Something inside her cracked. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, her fingers slid into his. "Yes!" A stunned silence. Then an explosion of voices, gasps and disbelief. James gave her hand a firm squeeze, his grip steady, unwavering. His voice was calm, unwavering, as he turned to the officiant. "Shall we continue?" The priest hesitated, looking between them. Charlotte wasn't sure if her voice would work, but somehow she managed a nod. And just like that, the ceremony continued. Not as planned, not with the man she had expected, but with the stranger who had stepped in without hesitation. As James slid the ring onto her finger, his touch warm and sure, Charlotte's heart thundered. What had she just done? Chapter 2. A stranger for a husband. The applause was scattered, hesitant. A shock, more of a murmur than a celebration. Charlotte barely heard it. She barely felt anything at all. Her hand was still in James Calloway's, warm and firm, as they walked down the aisle together. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating and surreal. She had just married a stranger. The reception hall was already set up, brimming with expensive floral arrangements and a 5-tiered wedding cake that suddenly seemed ridiculous. James didn't let go of her hand as he guided her through the crowd. She caught glimpses of people. Her mother, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, her father watching James with calculating eyes. Ava, looking like she might faint. And then, there were the whispers. What the hell just happened? Did she seriously marry him instead? Who even is James Calloway? Charlotte pulled her hand free the moment they were out of earshot. She turned to face him, finally allowing herself to really look at him. James was calm, too calm. His suit was tailored to perfection, his sharp jawline set with quiet confidence. His dark blue eyes studied her, as if waiting for the inevitable explosion. She didn't disappoint. "Why did you do that?" Her voice came out harsher than she intended. James didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. "Because you deserved better than being left humiliated at the altar." Charlotte's throat tightened. The logical part of her screamed that this was reckless, insane, but another part, the part still raw from Ethan's betrayal, whispered that James was right. Still, she pressed on. "We barely know each other. You didn't have to step in." "I didn't have to," James agreed, his voice smooth and unreadable. "But I wanted to." That answer did nothing to calm the storm inside her. The reception was a blur. Charlotte went through the motions, cutting the cake, smiling for photos she wouldn't even want, accepting congratulations from guests who didn't know what to say. James never strayed far from her side. He played the part of the composed, attentive groom flawlessly, at never pushing but never letting her face the chaos alone. At one point, he leaned in and murmured, "If you want to leave, just say the word." She met his gaze. He wasn't forcing her into this. He was giving her an out. But Charlotte lifted her chin. No, she had chosen this. Chosen him. Running away now would only make things worse. And so, they danced. James' hand settled at the small of her back as he guided her across the floor. The music swelled, and for a moment, just a moment, the world faded. His touch was steady, his movements effortless. "You're surprisingly good at this," she murmured, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. "You sound surprised," he said, lips twitching slightly. "I am. You don't seem like the type who dances often." "I don't." A pause. Then softer. "But I would if it meant keeping your mind off him." Her breath caught. He wasn't saying Ethan's name, but it lingered between them like a ghost. James's grip tightened ever so slightly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Charlotte felt something strange. Safe. It was absurd. She didn't know this man. She didn't understand his motives, and yet, standing in his arms, she wasn't unraveling the way she had been moments before. The song ended, and applause rang out. Charlotte barely noticed as James led her off the dance floor. Minutes later, they were slipping into the sleek black car that would take them away from the reception, away from her old life. The penthouse. The ride was silent. Charlotte stared out the window, mind racing. When they arrived, she expected a hotel or maybe an unfamiliar house. Instead, James led her into a high-rise penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. It was stunning, expensive, but cold. "This is where you live?" she asked, stepping inside. "Yes." She swallowed. "And this is where I'm supposed to live now?" James unbuttoned his jacket, watching her carefully. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to." That surprised her. "What does that mean?" "It means I won't keep you here against your will." He leaned against the counter, arms crossing. "But if we're going to do this, Charlotte, we do it right. A real marriage, at least in public. No one can know this was a last-minute decision." Her stomach twisted. "A real marriage? For how long?" she asked. James held her gaze. "As long as it takes." "Takes for what?" A flicker of something passed through his eyes. "For the world to believe it." Charlotte exhaled sharply, suddenly feeling exhausted. "There's a guest room down the hall," James said. "Take it if you want, or you can take the master. I'll sleep elsewhere." That caught her off guard. "You don't expect—" James cut her off smoothly. "I won't touch you, Charlotte. Not unless you ask me to." A strange, unfamiliar heat curled in her stomach. Not because she wanted that, not yet, anyway, but because of how certain he sounded. How patient. Her fingers clenched at her sides. "I don't understand you, James." He gave her a small, unreadable smile. "Then take your time figuring me out." And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of his penthouse, alone with a husband she didn't know. Chapter 3. The Heat Beneath the Mystery. Charlotte woke up disoriented. The bed was too large, the sheets softer than anything she'd ever slept in. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting golden streaks across the penthouse bedroom's pristine white walls. And then it hit her. She wasn't in her apartment. She wasn't waking up as Charlotte Lawson, a soon-to-be bride with a predictable life. She was Charlotte Calloway now, a wife, married to a man she barely knew. Sitting up abruptly, she pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to push away the lingering haze of exhaustion. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a fever dream. The wedding, the reception, James's steady hand in hers, his unreadable expression as he laid out the terms of their arrangement. "I won't touch you, Charlotte, not unless you ask me to." The words replayed in her mind, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. She shook it off. She needed coffee. And answers. Throwing on the silk robe she found draped over the foot of the bed, no doubt placed there by James, she padded barefoot through the penthouse. The place was sleek, modern, and meticulously organized, every detail exuding quiet power and control, just like its owner. The scent of freshly brewed coffee led her to the open-concept kitchen, where James stood at the stove, flipping a pan over the burner with effortless ease. For a moment, she just watched. He was shirtless beneath a pair of dark pajama pants, his broad shoulders and defined muscles flexing as he moved. It was disarming, seeing him like this, domestic and relaxed, instead of the unreadable man who had turned her world upside down. James glanced up, catching her staring. "Good morning." His voice was smooth, carrying none of the awkwardness she felt. Charlotte cleared her throat. "You cook?" A small smirk played at his lips. "I do a lot of things, Charlotte." Something about the way he said her name sent a flicker of heat through her. She ignored it. "Right, so what's the plan?" she asked, pulling out a bar stool at the kitchen island. "For us. For us. For this marriage." James slid a plate of eggs and toast in front of her before pouring a cup of coffee and setting it beside her. "Eat first." She huffed but picked up her fork, realizing she was hungrier than she thought. They sat in silence, the only sound the clinking of utensils against porcelain. Finally, James spoke. "We'll keep up appearances. Go out together. Be seen. People will talk, but as long as we don't give them reason to question it, they'll accept the marriage as real." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "And what happens when they start asking why I married a man I barely knew hours after being left at the altar?" Um, James took a sip of coffee, unfazed. "Then we give them a story." "A story?" "We tell them we were seeing each other in secret, that Ethan was never the right man for you, and when he left, I stepped in to claim what was already mine." Charlotte nearly choked on her coffee. "Claim what was already yours? Do you hear yourself?" His lips twitched, but his expression remained composed. "Would you rather the truth?" She scowled. "And what's the truth, James? Because I still don't know why you did this." A beat of silence stretched between them. Finally, he set his cup down and met her gaze. "Because I couldn't watch you be abandoned." The words sent a strange flutter through her chest. She wanted to believe him, but something told her there was more to it than that. "You barely know me," she pointed out. James leaned in slightly, resting his arms on the counter. "No, Charlotte, you barely know me." His voice was low, smooth, carrying an underlying challenge. Something flickered in his eyes, something dark, something knowing. Her pulse quickened. There was a heat beneath the mystery of James Calloway, a quiet intensity that unsettled her. And worse, she wasn't sure if it scared her or thrilled her. Later that afternoon, Charlotte wandered through the penthouse, trying to piece together the man she had married. There were no personal photos, no signs of family or a past life. Everything was too neat, too controlled. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small study filled with books, worn leather-bound volumes, as if they'd been read over and over again. A single framed photograph sat on the desk. A much younger James, maybe in his late teens, standing beside an older man with the same piercing blue eyes. Before she could study it further, a voice interrupted. "Looking for something?" She turned sharply, finding James leaning against the doorway. He had changed into a crisp dress shirt, the top button undone. Charlotte nodded toward the photo. "Who is he?" James's expression cooled. "My father." "And where is he now?" she pressed. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Dead." Charlotte swallowed. She hadn't expected that answer. "I'm sorry." James held her gaze for a long moment before exhaling. "It was a long time ago." His voice was softer now, but the steel beneath it remained. Charlotte wanted to ask more, but something about the way he stood, rigid, guarded, made her stop. Whoever James Calloway truly was, he wasn't ready to let her see it. Yet. That evening, James informed her they had an event to attend, a high-profile charity gala, the perfect place to be seen together to sell their story. Charlotte wasn't prepared for the way people stared, not with pity like they had at the wedding, but with curiosity. They whispered as she walked in on James's arm, eyes scanning her for cracks in the facade. James, ever the composed businessman, played his role perfectly. His touch light on the small of her back, his voice low as he murmured in her ear to guide her through conversations. And for the first time, Charlotte played along. She let herself lean into the role of his wife, smiling at the right moments, nodding as if she had always belonged at his side. It was during a quiet moment by the bar that she realized he was watching her. "What?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "You surprise me," he murmured, taking a sip of his drink. "How so?" "You're stronger than I expected." The way he said it made something inside her tighten. Their eyes locked, and for a brief second it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. James Calloway was still a mystery, still unreadable, But as his fingers brushed hers deliberately, lightly, Charlotte realized something unsettling. She wanted to figure him out, and that terrified her more than anything. Chapter 4: Secrets and Slow Burn Desires. The gala had been a test, one Charlotte hadn't even realized she was taking, and she had passed. Now, back in the penthouse, she kicked off her heels and let out a deep breath. The night had been exhausting, filled with forced smiles, scrutinizing stares, and the ever-present warmth of James at her side. He had played the part of the devoted husband effortlessly. But what unsettled her most was how easily she had played along. She turned to find James standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out over the glittering city skyline. His bow tie was undone, the top two buttons of his dress shirt loosened. He looked different like this, less composed, less perfect, more dangerous. "Are you going to tell me the real reason you did this?" she asked, breaking the silence. James turned, his expression unreadable. "I already did." "No, you gave me an answer that sounded good, but that's not the same as the truth." His lips quirked slightly, as if amused by her persistence. "You're getting bolder, Mrs. Calloway." The way he said it, low, deliberate, sent an unwelcome heat through her. She crossed her arms, unwilling to let him distract her. "You don't strike me as a man who does things out of sentiment. So, why step in?" James studied her for a long moment, then slowly approached. His movements were always measured, calculated, like a man who never acted without purpose. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for making sure Ethan doesn't get what he wants." Charlotte stiffened. This was about Ethan? Partially. James tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. "Did you ever wonder why he really left you at the altar?" Her stomach twisted. Of course she had wondered. She had spent hours replaying every interaction, trying to pinpoint the moment Ethan had decided she wasn't enough. But she hadn't expected James to hint that there was more to the story. "What do you know?" she demanded. James hesitated, something flickering behind his gaze. "Not yet." "Not yet?" she repeated, incredulous. "Are you kidding me? If you know something, you—" "Trust me, Charlotte." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something final. Trust. The word felt foreign when it came to him. And yet, she swallowed hard, looking up into those dark blue eyes, searching for deception. Instead, she found something else. Intensity. And something even more dangerous. Something she wasn't ready to name. "I don't trust you," she whispered. James leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a murmur. "Then why does it feel like you want to?" The air between them grew thick, charged. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive, laced with a hint of something deeper. For a second, just a second, she had the terrifying thought that if he kissed her right now, she might not stop him, so she did the only thing she could. She stepped back. "Good night, James." Her voice was steadier than she felt. James watched her for a long moment before giving a slight nod. "Good night, Charlotte." She turned and walked away, but even as she reached her room, she felt it. The weight of his gaze, the pull of something unspoken, and the slow, undeniable realization that this marriage, fake or not, was changing something between them, something neither of them could ignore for much longer. That night, Charlotte dreamt of hands, strong and warm, sliding over her bare skin, of lips at her throat, teasing, lingering, of dark blue eyes watching her with something possessive. She woke up breathless, her pulse racing. It had been a dream. Just a dream. But as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, heart pounding, she knew the truth. It wasn't Ethan she had been dreaming of. It was James, and that terrified her more than anything. The next morning, Charlotte did her best to act normal. She dressed, had breakfast, and pretended she hadn't spent the night dreaming of the man sitting across from her. James, of course, seemed entirely unaffected. He read the newspaper, sipped his coffee, and barely acknowledged her presence, which should have been a relief. Instead, it annoyed her. "You're awfully quiet today," she said, leaning against the counter. James glanced up. "Am I?" "Yes." "Which means you're thinking about something." "I think about a lot of things, Charlotte." She rolled her eyes. "Right, because you're such a man of mystery." A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "You're the one trying to solve me." Her cheeks heated, but she refused to look away. "Maybe I just like knowing what I'm dealing with." James set his coffee cup down and stood. As always, he moved with a kind of quiet confidence that made her pulse quicken. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze. You think knowing me will make this easier? His voice was quiet, laced with something dangerous. Careful, Charlotte. You might not like what you find. Her breath hitched. James held her gaze for a second longer before stepping back. Get dressed, he said, as if nothing had just happened. We have somewhere to be. Charlotte exhaled, trying to steady herself. James Calloway was a mystery, and whether she liked it or not, she was starting to want to unravel him.